So let's start. So again, thank you so much, David, for being with us. What we can expect from David, that he will take us through some differences or pros and cons, however we want to call it, for the agile sourcing and when it's better to use it versus the RFP. So thank you so much, David, being with us, and over to you. Just a little bit of the housekeeping. We will be taking the questions. So I would like to ask you guys to write the questions alongside of the presentation of David. We will answer the questions in the end of the presentation. So we are just allowing the presentation to flow smoothly. So if you have any questions, please do drop it down immediately whenever you think, and then we will take it in the end. So other than that, enjoy, and over to you, David. Thank you so much for being with us.
Lovely. Well, thank you, Susanna, for the platform to speak to everybody in the IRMA group. So as you can see on screen there, the title Agile Sourcing is at the end of the RFP, or request for proposal, just to do a quick acronym check there. Really what we're going to talk through mainly here is a new approach to objective vendor selection, emphasis on the word objective. And how we do that tonight is going to be basically in two halves. So the first part is going to be dedicated to agile sourcing, a bit on the background of IT sourcing in general, some of the human issues that we see and some of the risks that come out of that. Then there's a little bit for you guys. We're going to do a little straw poll at the end of that section. Then the second half, we delve into real world IT contracts, where we've actually done some risk analysis or some analysis of a large number of existing client signed contracts, show you some of the results, which might be quite surprising, and then focus in on some of the real key ones and offer some advice on which areas to look out for, how to do things a bit better. Move through to a little poll again, which will be a simpler show of hands on that Susanna will run on how things are done within your organisations, and then finish on a good sourcing checklist, our conclusions, and then, as Susanna says, the Q&A at the end. So I will start my clock here to make sure that I try and stay on time. And off we go. So firstly, and I still find this amazing, that as I'm sure a lot of you guys know, being IT professionals, there are many standards and methodologies that cover various parts of IT. For instance, if you're doing a project, you might be Prince2 trained, or the project management might be using Prince2. For IT architecture and enterprise architecture, there's standards such as TOGAF or COBIT. Then for all the infrastructure, there's ITIL, which has become a global standard. And then under IT security, there are several standards such as ISO, NIST, the government ones, etc. What's amazingly left out of all of those is how you pick your applications and your key service providers in the first place. It's still left pretty much to best endeavours and internal policies and practices. There's nothing like a Prince2 or a TOGAF or an ITIL that's certainly that popular. There's something from one of the trade organisations that have been pushing a bit of a standard. We've seen standards in other countries, but still pretty much every client situation we get involved with, it's DIY and best endeavours. At the same time, everybody, when they go out to market, obviously want to get the best service they can, a fair contract, and also get the thing done, because often it's a bolt-on to busy people's roles, and you're expected to do it all internally, which can be quite tough. So that's just a little bit of scene setting. I did want to get straight into the bit about RFPs, and we'll be asking some questions on this one later. So is there an image problem with the request for proposal? Now, one thing we see from the customer or the client view is that it can be seen as a pain, being frank. It's very heavily administrative, lots of paperwork. How much value really is there in doing it? Or is there a draconian procurement department within your organisation that mandates you must use this RFP template, even when you're buying something very small, so you kind of feel like you're obliged to? and do those mandates encourage avoidance and heading off down a more kind of casual approach, for want of a better word, which can lead to equally large problems further down the track. So that's just a quick kind of straw poll from customers, if you like. Equally on the supplier side, and I think from the attendee list, it looked like we might have a few technology suppliers on the webinar tonight. You receive a 60-page, let's say, RFP document. That takes a lot of effort to prepare a bid response to. You know, it might make you not bid due to that effort, and often there's a lot of boilerplate content goes into it anyway. I'm sure we've all had bid responses where you can see the previous organisation it was used for. So really, you know, the generation and the management of that RFP can be quite painful. Like I said, on the customer side, it can be 40, 50, 60 pages long, multiple authors perhaps, you know, maybe it's gone around various business units. And one thing is for sure, that once it goes around multiple people, they never get smaller. They only ever add more and more questions. And really that can be quite a clunky situation to get into. So if that's RFP kind of snapshot, what are these avoidant processes or alternatives to that, which we also see, which you know, organizations can end up doing for whatever reason, be it kind of human nature or they're kind of forced into it to avoid the RFP. A table of some of the bad ways to source, and we're saying that there's 5 ways not to choose. It's actually 4 plus what the one at the end, something slightly different, but this is just worth dwelling on, because that first one, let's start talking to some bidders. We've had a look around online, or we think we know who we want to talk to. Let's start some conversations. That is route 1 for anyone that's not doing an RFP. And it's easy, and it can be quite pleasant, because obviously you always get a good response from keen bidders. The problems come on the right hand side there, that tends to lead to them giving you a demo of the system or the service or the PowerPoint, whatever it is, in their way. And you and the team might sit there and kind of absorb this and then do the same with vendor 2 and vendor 3 and vendor 4. It's not comparable. And if there's one take home from tonight, please put this down as one of the key ones. So many organizations we see wind up with incomparable bids and certainly in incomparable costs, because they've just let the vendors roll their standard sales pitch at them, which is nice for a while and an easy start, but you end up in a pickle at the end. And ultimately, when you're choosing something that's important enough to do a selection process, i.e. it's probably going to be several £100,000, if not millions, spent over the lifetime, and or it's going to be a critical service, there's normally anywhere up from 30 choosing points, and vendor demos only give you a pretty narrow slice of that. So that's let's start talking to bidders. The next one down, maybe a bit more political, but again, I want to sort of talk straight with everybody tonight. A favourite might be an incumbent, and obviously there's a whole bunch of good reasons why an incumbent might be favoured, or there's somebody senior in the business that says, no, you guys go straight to this vendor, I know them, they're good. Now that's probably one of the trickiest positions to be in, because it's unlikely to be best fit. No matter how senior that stakeholder is, they won't know all of the genuine business requirements split out across the various categories of business requirement. It's great to include them in a competition, and that can be a nice kind of mid-ground if you've got a particularly fiery stakeholder that's insisting. And of course, at the end of that, if they're that close with your senior stakeholder, you're in a very weak position to do much in terms of negotiating on contractual terms and cost and SLAs and some of the things that are really going to count for the ongoing run phase and the success of this thing. So that's number 2. Number 3, unfortunately, also a common thing that we see in organisations. Just stick it onto your day job. You can do it. Now, sometimes that can come from the CFO. Unfortunately, it's actually quite a multi-skilled exercise doing a selection. It involves some IT skill for sure. It involves a bit of legal / paralegal expertise. It certainly involves some commercial nous, and there's a financial element to it too. So it's normally more than one IT person can manage, but it's often ends up being done that way. And it really needs to be framed in the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, these purchases are typically going to be in for 5 to 10 years. I think I saw a statistic that the average line of business application and or ERP is in for an average of 11 years. They're not the kind of thing you want to sort of rip out easily. So there are major benefits to doing it well, and we'll come back to a point that it's worth planning for that up front as soon as you can. On to the fourth one. Now, this is the either someone that's in a rush because it's their nature, or maybe they have got a looming deadline. You know, we can do this faster. There's no time to do sourcing. We're just going to kind of plow in, normally start with vendor demos and end up in a bit of a mess. It tends to cost a lot more time later on. You end up in kind of iterative, diminishing circles, or you end up just having to go with something that isn't the best fit and regret later. We are championing sourcing professionals as one of the answers to this. They do tend to save a lot more than they cost and are worth their weight in gold, and also help you avoid the cost iceberg, which we've got a slide on later. So that's it on the kind of the four sort of common and sort of bad approaches to sourcing. The last one isn't so much about sourcing, it's more about once you've picked. Again, when people or organizations are under time pressure, we do sometimes see often the technical function saying, right, we've picked the thing, we've got the rough costs sorted, don't bore me with all the contractual admin, let's start on a letter of intent and you guys sort out the dot the I's and cross the T's later. Now the problem with that is that you're basically giving away your ability to negotiate a better position with that vendor because they know they're in. And actually T's and C's and schedules, as we'll see later on, actually should represent how the service should both be built and run. So when it's done well, it's actually quite an operational document, and it's very much in client interest to get that one done. Unfortunately, last point there, the default position, the vendor standard T's and C's, always favours them. And that might be old news to a lot of people, but they are always negotiable, even with the big vendors. You know, we've certainly got traction out of the Salesforces, the Oracles, the SAPs, and it's always in your interest to address those. So just remember, you customer, them supplier would be the take home on that one. So let's make things a little bit more positive. If those are some of the bad ways to do these things, if I get back to the PowerPoint, oops, there goes the alarm, stop. Routes to objective scoring. So we've just laid out the typical RFP process across the top, just as a little aid memoir. So it's the build the RFP document. We would normally recommend dividing requirements into these three categories. Often folks focus on function and technical at the expense of commercial requirements. But I'll gloss over that. So that's the big 60-pager, into bidder responses, scoring, costs, evaluation report, pick the winner, and then on to supply negotiations and contracts and schedules. So it's not all bad. We're not kind of saying the RFP is you know, completely dead. It certainly suits some situations, but the newer route, which is the main title of this presentation, is Agile Sourcing, which I shall move straight onto and start to highlight some of the differences. So what we do with Agile is we ditch the RFP document, no more 60-pager, and say to the client, let's write up 10 to 15 maximum one-pager business scenarios of what you want this thing to do, be it a piece of software or a technology service. And each scenario is to be like a day in the life of a certain user for what they want it to do and what the outcome should be. And we have a template to do that. It's a bit like a use case for anybody that's familiar with those, but a much more simplified and useful for this process. We've kind of been through it and kind of honed it. And that is then later used for scoring. So that's the first kind of major difference. And obviously writing 15 pages is a lot quicker than writing 60. and tends to, I think when you say it's got to be 10 to 15, it focuses the mind on which ones are really the key things. Next one down, suggested bidders. Possibly doing a bit more market research and a bit of prequel on who are the best ones to go to for this. And we still recommend going out to around about 8 bidders for this. And then finally agreeing how these things are going to be scored. Typically it's directly off the scenario, who the scoring team is going to be, and any initial weightings between which scenarios are either more important than others or some might be mandatory. As an example, one of our current projects, scenario number 1 was that the system had to work offline. This particular client had a lot of field operations, and that slayed quite a few bidders at the first post, which is actually good because then you focus on the ones that can do it. Anyway, back to the process then. So that's the preparation. That goes out to the bidders along with a wrap document that just kind of tells them the rules. The next key thing is that bidders then present to your scenarios. So rather than rolling through their usual sales spiel, you give them an hour or 2 slot to present each of the 15 scenarios. You know, if it's software, it's show us your system doing our scenario. You know, you configure it to do what we want. Your team is then in the room, live scoring what they see, and that's then used directly afterwards to shortlist and whittle down. So I think one of the main differences here is that this gets you in front of suppliers and their offerings more quickly than the RFP process. So you kind of get to see a little bit of the art of the possible, and enables you, if you want to kind of cherry pick from one, there's going to be a second round perhaps. Again, we'll come on to some of the sort of differences between the RFP and some of the pros and cons with this. But ultimately, as we get towards the back end, once you have done the shortlist, and we do ask for rough costs during this, and it's deliberately rough because you can't get exact costs until the back end, but you can at least get some cost metrics and a rough idea, which again might help you pick the shortlist. But then once you've got it down to, let's say, 3 bidders, you then go back and do a technical evaluation, a commercial evaluation, which will include the full cost model. So you're kind of still doing all the diligence, but rather than doing it across absolutely everybody, you're shortlisting first on functionality. Can they do fundamentally what we want? If not, bye-bye. If yes, great, we'll move on to the next stage. And then at the back end, as ever, price negotiations and contractual negotiations. So that's the overall process. It is, as you can see, quite a different beast than the RFP. We've had questions in the past around how much of an audit trail does this represent compared to an RFP. I think because there is an evaluation report with all the selection logic in here, it's perfectly valid in terms of an audit trail. I tell you, we'll move on to the differences as well, just to highlight how it does differ from an RFP. So as we've said, it's a much faster start, and that's not to be kind of underestimated, because RFPs can become quite painful sometimes, especially in sort of medium to large organizations with multiple departments. When it goes round and round and it's got multiple different authors, it can get quite painful. And there is something in projects to be said for having some momentum and actually getting the thing moving. Also, if you've got any staff that are less familiar with doing huge business documents, I think scenarios are a bit more easy to get your arms around and understand, and a bit more kind of their thing. So your team sees the art of the possible, and again, you're of course free to then, you know, alter your requirements slightly for round 2 should you see fit. And then again, interestingly, I had some feedback from some vendors on our last project on this. Vendors prefer this. No one had seen it before on the last project that we ran, because they haven't got a huge 60-page document landing with a whoomp on the desk. This is easier for them to do. There's not an initial huge written response. It's more them configuring their software or presenting their service on what you want. So if those are some of the positives. Again, I want to be honest about some of the challenges that it can present as well. First one there, diary pressure. because we're saying that rather than the RFP bids, imagine 8 bids come back, which are each 70 pages long. Those get sent around the evaluation team of, let's say, 5, 10, 15 people. There's an awful lot of reading effort and scoring effort needs to go into that. The difference with Agile is that the first round of scoring is done live as they watch and score the presentations. Now, the pressure there is that they've all got to be in the room or on the webinar at the same time. Yes, you could watch a recording later, but I think being part of the live chat is quite important in these scenarios. And also the scoring team needs to be the same for follow-up presentations. So again, it's ultimately it's a sort of a diary and forward planning thing to make sure that you're not doing it over the holidays, etc. But you really, if you're going to have 8 vendors presenting, let's say, you want the same people watching and scoring every time. And then I know we've mentioned this already, but just to doubly emphasize that this process shortlists firstly on functionality, on their functional performance, not on the technology or the commercials. Because some people do say, but what if we shortlist somebody on functional that turns out to have awful technicals or commercials? That is a risk, but the benefits of this are that most folks care very much that it's functionally got to do. That's the primary thing. And technicals and commercials are the next stage, equally important, but funnel on functionality first. And if you really need to go back and pull somebody else in that scored lower on functional because you hope their technical and commercial is going to be good, then you can do that. It's not like you're you're behold to your initial shortlisting, but ultimately you're really kind of focusing your diligence on the shortlistees rather than spreading it across everybody every time. Now there's a little star down here that we do shortlisting primarily on functional performance. Now it's got to be said, this is a human environment. During vendor presentations, you might see some aspects of the technology that you do or don't like. So that's happened on a recent project, and some of the commercial or kind of team elements might appear as well. Again, you can throw that in the mix if you wish, but we try to say phase 1 really is functional first, technology and commercials second. So that's it in terms of the those main differences. Now, moving on to selection processes in general. If you ever get any pressure on, oh, do we really need to do this? What's the value? Is it just academic? Again, comparability. We're back to this being objective and scoring, having comparable bids in terms of a percentage quality score, which you can weight across your scenarios, and comparable costs. That is absolute gold dust, and gives you that kind of audit trail and rationale. Well, here's why we chose these guys. So I think that's the first big value area. I'd say the second one, which is quite interesting, is when you do ask an organisation to actually document their requirements, and that could be, with the big RFP, it could be just with the 10 or 15 scenarios, but it does focus minds, and it can also start to surface any kind of disparities between the organisation over what counts more or what they thought by that. It's the classic kind of stuff that if you just sit there watching vendor demos, that doesn't get surfaced. So we're certainly very much advocates of making sure that requirements are documented appropriately. Then the last one, of course, what you always want to end up with at the end of one of these selection processes is an end contract that's fair and suits you. Now, again, another big benefit of running a good selection process is that this lays the groundwork for that. Once you've shortlisted within Agile, you can actually put out some key commercial requirements, let's say, to your remaining bidders and say, these are the things that we must have. And it might be cost format, it might be certain SLAs, it might be certain account management requirements, it might be certain key terms. Now, we do suggest, by the way, that you issue, let's say, 10 or 20 maximum key terms that you want, rather than issuing your standard contract. We do see some folks that have had somebody, external counsel perhaps, or it's an in-house document to try and foist upon vendors. That doesn't tend to work so well, we find, because most vendors, certainly the larger ones, have got quite extensive contracts already, and it's much easier to amend theirs than enforce yours. Again, I must say, it's slightly odd doing this as a webinar. The good thing about doing this to a live audience is you can see people nodding. I can kind of get a sense if I'm teaching grandma to suck eggs. So apologies if that's the case for anybody. So on to again, the value of being objective. Again, this human need for the early favourite. Again, just reiterate that because it's just something to really guard against, and it's almost an open question. Is this just human nature that people are unhappy with uncertainty, and you meet people, vendor demos, or start to meet the account management team and start to settle on somebody? One observation we've got from our projects over the years, that in almost half of our projects where we're doing a selection, there is an early favourite, and in probably half of those or more, that early favourite drops by the wayside when we actually shine the lights of objectivity on them and ask some, searching questions. And I've had CEOs contact me to say, basically, thank God we did this. We would have gone with those guys because they were an incumbent who said they could do all the extra stuff, and it turned out when you ask properly, they really couldn't. So really, we're talking about a structured set of questions and being able to score the answers, because there is just too much to choose from to hold in your head, and vendor demos are just one element. So really, this is quite a popular graphic over here on the right. This is ultimately what you want to be beaming up on the board wall. Here's our 5 bidders, here's the total lifetime cost, and here's the quality score that we've given to each of them. So between price and percentage quality score, that's normally enough to pick the winner or the shortlist. So that's it on being objective. Last point on being vendor-led, and again, just hammering this one home because it's so common, because it is an easy way to start. They nearly always want to do demos. We actually had a recent project where a vendor bidder kind of complained, saying that these scenarios and the flow of these scenarios doesn't follow our usual sales presentation. And we paused and said, no, we want you to do it our way. And they kind of ultimately did. So whilst as we got there on the slide, the penultimate bullet there, you will see the art of the possible, but you won't be able to compare. So we really would recommend getting your requirements down before you engage with vendors, just to make sure you don't end up without comparability. So last one before we get onto the poll. Again, so when we're talking to organisations about running a selection process, be it Agile or RFP, here are some of the top questions or points, normally from in a rush people, often CIOs, saying, okay, let's skip the vendor warm-up, we don't need to do that, or let's reuse an old RFP to speed things up. Can we go to fewer bidders? Let's address each one of these in turn rather than me read them through. Skipping vendor warm-up. We find that the vendors are ever more careful about what they will and won't bid for. So again, this favours Agile, that you hit them with an RFP. Christ, this is a lot of effort, pardon my French. Whereas Agile is an easier start for them. Also, gone are the days where you perhaps turn up with a pile of money and expect all the vendors to be super keen. They're much more calculated about what they will and won't bid for. As you may know, they've got algorithms. They'll look at, are you an existing customer? Are you an existing sector? What's the requirements match like? Which is all fair enough. So we find a bit of human contact early on with them to introduce them to the project and make it real goes a long way, and also prevents as many no bids later on. That's the last thing you want. Second one, reusing an old RFP. Again, I'm hoping that one doesn't even need too much logic to shoot down. If it's an RFP process you want to run, okay, there might be boilerplate bits, but certainly the requirements need to be all completely different. and that's really the heart of it. With Agile, that doesn't really apply because it'll be different scenarios for a different service. Going to fewer bidders. I'm not sure that actually compresses the timeline particularly. It might reduce the effort slightly, but going out to 4 instead of going out to 8, it's only really incremental man-day effort rather than calendar timeline compression. And the thing with going out to just say 4 is often you'll find that there's an outlier or two who are either very expensive or very poor. And once you're down to just having 2 or 3 in a competition, it's not really enough. So we still find 8's a good number to start with. Give bidders less time to respond. This is a very common one. Now, again, bearing in mind that this thing that you're buying is probably going to be in for a long time and or very important and or very expensive. Saving or trying to chop a week or 2 off bidders preparing their response is massively counterproductive and normally ends up, we find, with the bidders at the last minute saying, can we have an extension? So that's not a great one. Choosing quicker, again, I think Agile kind of forces you to, if you can get everybody in the room, to choose quicker. Other than that, there isn't really much you can say about the timeline on evaluation. The last one, I think we've talked about the risks of the letter of intent, the LOI, and certainly accepting a standard contract. Again, we see so many situations where clients have got into a poor situation, and we will come on later and examine that one in particular in a lot more depth, because it's quite amazing how unfair most IT contracts are that clients have signed, even ones that have been through lots of internal controls. But we'll come back to that one. So hopefully that's the last of the kind of the bad news, if you like, on selection. So Susanna, I wanted to move on to the poll now, just to quickly ask folks how they find. Let me just get onto the right slide. Yeah, this one. Which ones of these sourcing bad sourcing approaches they've experienced when it comes to a a major IT service or software purchase? Have you ever ended up just, let's start by talking to the bidders, or was there kind of a favourite? Was it just thrown to you and expected to bolt onto the day job, or was it the cavalier, right, we can do this quicker, let's crack on, we don't need to do any proper sourcing? So those are the 4 sort of bad sourcing approaches, and then the 5th one was once you've picked, let's just start an LOI and get on with it. Now, we will be keeping the answers anonymous. We will just be aiming to show the global totals once those are in.
Yeah, so the poll is open. We are having over 74% voted. So we do have a bit of the results. So we will see if some more guys would like to quickly vote. Otherwise, I think we are up to the numbers.
Okay, yeah, happy to show that now and give the feedback kind of live. Maybe we'll flash it up at the end again if there's any kind of longer debate points out of that. I must say, I find this stuff fascinating, because I know there's a lot of people in large organisations on the webinar tonight who are undoubtedly buying important, critical, expensive stuff, and it's interesting to see how many times it's done through suboptimal methods, shall we say.
All right, so I'm closing the poll where 29% say let's start by talking. So first one, 50% the favorite, and 21% the under resource. So the most of the half who voted said the second option.
Wow, 50% going with the favorite. And
I think you can see that on the screen. I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but I just publish it. So I'm just showing it. 29 is with let's start by talking, 50 by favorite, and 21 by the under the resource selection exercise.
Wow. I mean, I can't see that on my screen, but maybe we'll come back to that at the end, because that might be worth a few Q&A sessions. No, thank you for that, Susanna.
No problem. A
Incredible.
question here, David, because I know that you're going to be, this one was like icebreaker between going further, but we do have 3 questions about the first part. Do you want to answer the question now or in the end?
Yeah, no, I think we're doing well on time. So I'm happy if we address some questions now. Just keeping an eye on the clock over here.
Yeah. So we do have first from John Mitchell, who is saying that he received a 750-page RFP for some IT audit work, and that he and his team, he has worked through it and conducted that they needed to provide 6 person per year on the job. And on the very last page of the RFP, it stated that they didn't expect bids for more than 3/4 of the person per year for the whole thing. So I think it's more like a John's comment that not all the RFPs are really precise. And when you were talking about the first bids, how they are conducted and what they are doing, that it's so much.
750 pages.
Yes, for IT
Wow.
audit work. It's only IT
I think
audit
that's
work.
I think that you've just set a new record there. I think we've seen some that run. So I think 350 was the previous biggest one we'd ever seen. I mean, to be honest, once you're over about 30 or 40 pages, it's just so unwieldy. That lands on an account manager's or account management's team's desk to respond to. And I think once you're into the hundreds, it's so counterproductive for you as the client. Then we've seen some where sometimes it can be the infrastructure department can be just to sort of point fingers here, can be very keen to add in lots of technical detail about the current solution. 300 pages about the server estate, and we normally find it's not useful detail in terms of doing your first selection and downlisting or shortlisting down. Yes, you might need that towards the back end, and certainly in terms of helping negotiate a transition schedule. But is that productive to choose up front? No, way too much detail. A précis of that or a picture of that, which is again uncommonly seen but very useful, is a much better way to do it. So I'll be interested. I didn't catch if John was a client or supplier in that 750 page scenario.
So he was
right.
Supplier for the IT audit work.
Right, you have my sympathies with that one. Was that be interesting to hear if that was public sector or not? But again, I'm missing being in a live audience here. I know it doesn't work so well with immediate Q&A. So yeah, Zuzana, if you want to move on to question 2.
So Sergio Calamaro, he said that for the public sector organizations, there are frameworks such as G-Cloud or OJU that restrict the option. However, he's supportive of anything that reduces the front loading of documents, but you can only pick one, not that all that you have experienced. So I think that's a comment towards the documentations.
No, that's a good point. Now, in terms of can you run an agile process when you're in the public sector? Actually, yes, you can. Now, frameworks. So let's address these in order. So frameworks and then OJU. So if you're using a framework to select, all that really is it's a short list of suppliers that you can then go to, where the government have negotiated some terms already for you. And to be honest, they're not that great, and you can actually supersede them yourself, but we'll come back to that. So you've got shortlist. How you then select from the framework is entirely down to you. It's normally called a mini competition. So you could run an Agile Sourcing mini comp over the people in your framework. The only restriction is that it's got to be the people in the framework only, but you can absolutely run an Agile one. And then under OJU, which is the bigger, weightier, kind of slower and more painful process, there are various approaches within OJU, and one of them, and I think it's what's it called? Something dialogue. I haven't done an OJU in a while. There's like an open dialogue version, which certainly would allow you to run an Agile Sourcing process. So I think where there's a will, there's a way in public sector procurement, because it can be very, very bureaucratic. And I know that the intent that the regulations try to achieve, but actually we often find it can be quite counterproductive. I think G-Cloud can help. Again, that's effectively another type of framework where there are some kind of pre-approved suppliers, that you can then run a competition over yourself. So it's certainly doable, Agile in the public sector.
Okay, and John just commented that the 750 pages has been public sector, so you were right about that. And we have one more question from Steve. David, how does this process scale? It looks like a workable option for a smaller RFP, but what if we have a major transformation to consider?
That's a good question. I would agree that it certainly suits things like choosing an ERP or choosing a line of business software or maybe an IT outsource. Can you scale it up to something that would need lots of scenarios? I think we'd really have to look at the scope and see, can it really be boiled down to 15 or maybe extend it to 20 scenarios? Gut feel tells me that when you actually get down to the requirement section of an RFP, there's, in terms of the key ones that are actually going to be differentiators, you can actually slice a lot of the requirements away because the answers are they going to be differentiators, and that's actually quite a good knife to use. So, I mean, for a transformation, possibly, I guess. I think that would be. We probably need to dig into the depths a little bit more on that and see what the exact scope for that is. I mean, typical scenarios for a transformation. You might want to include vendors something on track record, because that's obviously going to be more of less of a software demo than a kind of a demonstration of their service. So could you boil that into 15 or 20 things? I think maybe. Maybe we might have to pick that one up offline. That's a good one. Okay, Susanna, was that it on the 3 questions?
Yes, that's all, and I removed the poll, and you are back to your presentation now.
Superb. Well, if anyone's got any more questions at the end, feel free to ask. I think we're doing well on time. So the next bit, contracts. Now I realise it's getting late, and I don't want people falling asleep, but this is quite amazing. Some of the things we find here. What often ends up in contracts that get signed. So this might seem a little bit dramatic, but it really does fit the bill, the iceberg graphic. Massive simplification, but we often will see the contract does contain top line costs, a bunch of standard T's and C's, and then service descriptions, which we would characterize as input based. So it's written in the vendor's language, perhaps down to quite technical detail. But what's under the waterline is that the services aren't well described at the granular level. They're often not described in terms of what the outputs or the outcomes are going to be. And the pricing isn't related to those services. So when it comes to invoice time, how do you know what you're paying for? And often we find people get into quite a mess trying to cross-reference invoices back to the contract, because the contract is just too high level. And maybe the pricing is, it's 2 million a year, and it's kind of as straightforward as that. We also often find things like lock-in mechanisms. Often if you want to change the service, if you want to buy more of it, you can do that in a flash, and it's very easy. If you want to scale things down, perhaps there's nothing in there at all, or you've got to pay for the rest of the contractual value, or there's various other kind of invented mechanisms for the vendor to just maintain their revenue. Next one on exit. Who should do what, by when, and for how much in the event of an exit, for whatever reason triggers that. Often that is a silent area within contracts, and if you do need to invoke exit, you can be in a very weak position going to the vendor and hoping for goodwill at a time when relations might be quite frayed if you're leaving. Next one, we call these adventure book terms and conditions. So this is, rather than it being one clean document, it's a case of a clause says, and now refer to another document, turn to page 25 in this document, and then that document refers you to somewhere else, and it's a big kind of paper chase. That can be made worse by web-based T's and C's, which are ever more popular from vendors. The other downside of those, of course, is that they can change them without your knowledge whenever you like. So that's quite a risk area as well. And then last big one is having meaningful SLAs in your terms rather than just the vendor quoting their ones. I do remember an example from one of the big providers that was supplying a major retailer, and the SLAs on the face of it look great, but due to the scale of the retailer, 99 point whatever percent actually meant that I think one of their stores could go dark for 3 days on the trot, and the vendor still ticked the box. So having meaningful SLAs in your terms is important. And then lastly, service credits, which is another term for refunds. You know, if they don't match the SLAs, what's the recourse in terms of getting any money back? Now, it's not the be all and end all that, but it can help sharpen their attention. So really the point here is that we've been talking about selection approaches. If you include some of your commercial requirements up front in that selection process, you can find out from vendors if there are any horrors coming and deal with them accordingly, rather than the nightmare scenario where you pick based on the functionality is great, the technology is great, and oh my word, the contract's awful, and then perhaps you get railroaded and end up signing something that you regret later. So amazingly common, and to back that up, here is a slide of some research we've done where we analysed 25 real-world IT contracts from our clients over the years, and have picked out a range of the deficient or kind of exposure areas, starting with the from least to most popular. So even with the first one, 11 out of the 25 contracts we looked at did not cover security standards. It's amazing stuff. Now, you might say, oh, does that matter in every case? It matters in most cases. I can't think of too many IT services or systems where you don't care about security these days. Granular charges, I think we talked about on the iceberg one. How much should you be paying? And an exit again, we talked about, just to sort of pick those three out. So I know we've got some legal folks on the webinar tonight. I think really one of the take homes from this slide is that some of these areas we're talking about are not just standard law, it's actually IT law and IT operations. So don't necessarily rely on a generalist lawyer to know what good looks like across all of these areas. It is quite a hybrid skill area. So there's lots to absorb on that slide. So we're going to kind of take some of those away and just focus on some more of the sort of service and operational areas that really count for, I guess I'd call it a kind of successful ongoing run phase. Because I think one of the issue with some of these other areas that are still on screen now, and that we pick disaster recovery. Obviously, that only counts if there is a disaster. Equally, some things like let's have a look. Some areas of governance or escalation only really count if there's a major problem. And because I personally find that CIOs who are in a rush can kind of discount those, or presume that that's all the contract is, leave it to the lawyers. It's really the operational stuff that I wanted to focus on now, because I find people at the coalface tend to care about those a bit more. So we're just going to look at these: security, management of the services, the bank in the middle, around what are the services, what are the SLAs, what are the refunds, what are the charges linked to that, how do charges vary, and how do we define service quality. So another view of that and how these things are connected, crucially, over the slide here. So apologies for slightly lurid picture colours there, but I thought by this time of night we might need a bit of a shock. So services should define exactly what each one is, preferably include what some of the outcomes should be, and then to have a price linked to each service. Hence the kind of little green link up here. Good to include how price variation could or should and shouldn't work as well. Then again, the services being really the heart of the contract. SLA is then linked to the services, and then service credits linked back to all three. So if the SLA for service A fails, here's what needs to happen. Preferably in terms of some kind of a recompense. Standards as well, as we've seen, quite often lacking. We only talked about security earlier. There are a raft of other standards out there. Some companies have internal policies. Those should be referenced as well. And then also hanging on things like service reporting. What's the dashboard got to look like? What's the the monthly report? And then finally onto account management. What's the structure? Who do we escalate to? How often are we going to be seen? Are we going to be a small cog in a wheel? So really, if these are the main kind of moving parts in a contract, there's precision wording is required to get these things right, and then any changes need to be rippled across to the relevant parts. Again, we've seen plenty of contracts where changes have been made in one part but not properly reflected somewhere else, and the contract has become virtually kind of unworkable. So again, quite a precision skill area doing this kind of stuff. Now, just again, eye on the clock. I know we're kind of heading towards Q&A time soon, so I will aim to speed on. MSAs, Master Service Agreement, or T's and C's, and schedules. This is really the end of a selection process where all the hard work needs to be manifested in good black and white. Again, take-home point here is if you don't run a selection process, you're going to end up with more red flags, as we showed in the earlier slide, in your end contract, because vendor contract, the standards always favour them. Again, it's a bit broad brush, but from our analysis, roughly only half of the contract is the legal stuff. The rest is kind of a combination of service and commercial terms, and we've tried to sort of illustrate that with this picture here, that these schedules underneath ultimately will form the run book for the service. Now, we're not saying you need all these schedules on every single IT contract or telecoms contract you've got. This is for the bigger ones, but certainly having some element of each of these A to G things present is appropriate in most IT and service deals. So last straw poll for you guys is to ask, and I think Susanna wants to do this just as a simple show of hands, is who does the IT negotiations and contracting in your organisation? In smaller ones, it's often the CIO alone. In bigger ones, there's a mix of people. So Susanna, do you just want to sort of read through that list of 1 to 9 and sort of do the show of hands question and just run it that way?
Sure. Yeah, sure. It will be a little bit difficult to do it multiple, but if you guys just can raise the hands whenever I read the section number 1, I can see how many hands have been raised, and you can vote multiple times. So if you're gonna vote, you always just put the hands up, then put it down. When I see the second one, please put it up and put it down. So if we can start, if the one who is negotiating is your CIO or CISO, if you can just put the hands up right now. So far we do have one person, or let's say one vote. So if I can ask you just put the hands down, amazing. For the next one, senior IT management. So somebody from the IT management. So we are having so far 4 votes, 6 votes, 5. Somebody changed their mind. So if I can ask you for the hands down right now, thank you so much. The next one is legal, external or internal, that they are doing the negotiations. So we do have 4 votes. So if I can ask you, put the hands down again. The number 4 is CRO, risk management. Does anybody from your CRO's, chief risk officer, or anybody from the risk management? So there is nobody. Company secretary. Does anyone from the company does that? No. Procurement, number 6. So we are having around 5 votes so far. So we're having 6. So if I can ask you hands down again, thank you very much. Then number 7 is IT procurement specialist. So we have 3 votes, 4 votes. So again, we'll ask you hands down. Thank you so much. Business unit staff, number 8. So we are having 4. And then last one is for the finance or CFO. So we do have 2 votes so far, David. So from that point of view, I think the biggest one was for the procurement, and I think the senior IT management, if I'm not mistaken. So thank you so much. If you can put hands down, amazing, and that's all.
Moving on to the checklist for good IT sourcing, I think these are the main kind of 7 things that the kind of the big take homes here. Please include time for selection in your implementation plan. It does tend to take 3 months for something big, 4 months for something huge, like say a major ERP. And bearing in mind it's going to be in for a long time, that's time very well spent and will undoubtedly speed the implementation up as well. We do always recommend including some commercially qualified resource. CIPS is the industry standard. That's a Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply, but make sure the person's got some IT specialism. It is a general qualification, but people that have got 5 to 10 years of IT buying are gold dust and will be a really, really valuable addition to your team. Budget for them if you don't have any available in-house, because again, they tend to save a lot more than they cost. Although I think as one of our conclusions is it tends to be the contractual benefits that get valued more. Do try and engage your stakeholder if it's a CFO early on, who can often fob it off and say, this is for IT to do, it's part of the day job, crack on with it. Legal resource, we tend to find in-house legal is so flat out busy that if you do want to engage them, you need to book them well in advance and let them know at which points you're going to be bringing them into the process. 6 is for the scoring on Agile. As we said earlier, you've got to try and get a team into 8 presentations simultaneously. That takes a bit of diary management and juggling. And then, of course, for scenario building and scoring, engage the business, because it's ultimately them that's going to be using this thing. And they might need a bit of coaching into how to write a scenario, but that's all doable. And then they've got all the benefits of ownership and skin in the game, etc. So I would say they're actually quite, they can be fun processes to run these. Occasionally you do get a bit of drama with surprise dropouts, but well run tends to be good on the client side, and also vendors appreciate it when it's done properly and feel like they're getting kind of a fair view. So that's it on the good IT sourcing. I've got one more in terms of conclusions. I think those first 3 points I've probably hammered to death, so I'll move on. But just to say, it's so worth doing a selection process. We normally say if it's over 150k per year as a rough threshold of value and or critical, it's worth doing a selection process, because you're going to pick the right thing. You're going to get an improved risk position in your contract, and seriously, professional negotiators will save more than they cost you. And if that gets them, or that gets the kind of the CFO convinced to do it and gets the thing rolling, great. But many of our clients actually prefer the run book contract that they get at the end, that doesn't just get shoved in a drawer and forgotten, but actually gets used. So yeah, that's it. I would say overall that Agile, when we talk about it to clients and prospects, is getting a lot of smiles and a lot of traction. I think there's a lot of folks have had bad experiences with RFPs and are looking for something new. So yep, that's it from me. I think, Susanna, this we hand over for some more Q&A now, yeah?
Yes, we do have one more comment from John, which, by the way, he said that a great presentation, and he also said that both the lawyers and the IT staff had missed that the SLA for service availability was based on 3 months rolling average, and it was buried in the Appendix 21 of the SLAs, which is just sharing the story from his experience.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I share your pain, and I could genuinely talk all night around awful situations we've seen clients in. I know this is a risk management group, so one of my favourites was we worked for a very well-known investment bank who you think really would know better, but we looked at one of their existing contracts for a critical system, and the risk management department had done a reasonable review of the contract and pointed out quite a few of the red flags. And their report had been stapled to the back of the contract and put in a drawer. It hadn't actually been enacted or renegotiated with the vendor. It was just a corporate kind of box tick exercise. Amazing stuff, but that's how it is out there. Hopefully us folks can help start to change that and get things on a more sort of fairer footing. So thank you for that, John.
Yeah, and we don't have any more questions, but I would encourage people, if you guys want to speak on the microphone or you want to talk with David directly, just send me either chat or raise up the hand or something, and I can just let you speak. So up to you. Otherwise, thank you so much, David, for a great presentation. It has been very insightful, I think a little bit different. And I think very much useful for a lot of people, because I think not very many people do consider, for example, the information security clauses, which is the biggest problem in their contract. So I think it was very insightful. So thank you so much on the behalf of the BCS and IRMA special group. So thank you so much. I'm stopping the recording, but if anybody would like to ask more questions, please do let me know.
No, my pleasure, my pleasure. Now, if anybody wants to verbalise any questions, feel free. I know it's late and people have probably had long days, so hopefully I haven't talked to everybody to death. Yeah, if there's any questions via email afterwards, happy to field those, because I think Susanna, you're going to publish the presentation afterwards anyway.
Yeah, it will be available through the BCS YouTube channel and of course on the social media. But I think you do have the last post about your contact, so please do put it up. So if people want to contact with you, I keep saying, if it's not on the social media, it doesn't exist, and the better connection you get, the better network you have. But on the background, Steve and Grant, both of them saying that great presentation, very interesting. So kudos to you.